Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s. I am Matt Williamson, and with me today is writer and musician Jon Stewart. Now, if that name sounds familiar to you, there's a lot of Jon Stewarts out there, but this particular one was in the Britpop band Sleeper, and he has been writing as well. And Jon, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me on the show, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. So we're going to be talking about his new book, Dylan, Lennon, Marx God, which is a fascinating title in and of itself. We could talk about just the title, I think, for an hour. But Jon, why don't you just give us a little bit of your background briefly? I mentioned the band. I know you were big in the 90s and you've done some reunions recently, and now you've been writing. So give us a little bit of background.
Sure. I met singer Louise when I was at university in Manchester studying politics, and we formed a band and then got a record deal in the early 90s, and then were part of the whole Britpop scene and toured with Blur on their Park Life album tour in the UK, which was the one where you really knew something was about to take off, and just did pretty well in the 90s, and then went through that whole experience. It was an education in itself, and something I'm very grateful to have experienced. Moved to Los Angeles at the end of that, did some session playing, played on a K.D. Lang album, which was quite a cool experience, and then moved back to the UK and started working at a music school, teaching on a degree program from the University of Sussex, and did a doctorate at the University of Southampton after a few years, and that became this book. I guess I wanted to do something about anti-war protest music, so I was always fascinated where all the protest songs had gone during the Iraq War, why there wasn't more music around that. And the short answer is there was no conscription. That's why. And then that was it. That was that solved. And then off the back of that, my supervisor had some connections at Cambridge University Press, and they put it out as a book. And around about the same time in around about the time that the PhD was kind of coming to a head, my band Sleeper got back together. We did a reunion tour, which went really well. So we did another album, and then released an album of kind of lost recordings, one of which has George Michael on, and then I was invited to join a British band called the Wedding Present, if you know them, they're sort of semi-legendary British indie pioneers, and much bigger in the United States than Sleeper are actually. So I did an album with David Gedge from the Wedding Present, which was fantastic during lockdown. Did a couple of albums actually, and been doing some touring with them too. And that's basically it. And then the book came out, and we're here now.
So the book came out in 2021, correct?
2022 actually.
Oh, did it? So
right at the end of 21.
Hot off the press.
There was kind of there was a quite a lot of confusion about the release date due to various things going on at the press at the time. But 2022 in the United States, and technically it's a 2022 book. So this year still.
Well, the title certainly suggested some things to me. And in my studies over the last dozen or so years, the connectivity between the four titles in your book, Dylan, Lennon, Marx God. So why don't you give us a little bit of an overview, what you wanted to achieve by using those four topics together?
Sure. So initially, I just wanted to write about my favorite songwriters. So that's Bob Dylan and John Lennon, essentially. When you do a doctorate, you get the luxury of kind of picking what you want to study. And I just thought, if I'm going to spend some time looking at this, I should do the stuff that influenced me and that ruled my childhood, really. So then you kind of think, what themes am I going to look? How am I going to explore this? And I didn't want to write just another biography. So, because there's so many of those. So the first idea was this idea of a dual biography. And that came from an American literary theorist called Eloise Knapp Hay, who was writing in the 50s and 60s. And she made the argument for a good dual biography. You learn more about the individual subjects than you would in in a singular work. And she argued that Kipling and E.M. Forster, two literary giants in Britain, would make a good dual biography. And there's been quite a few since then. There's a famous one of Hitler and Stalin, and there's a few literary ones, and a couple of musical ones have come along since then. But no one had done Dylan and Lennon. And I thought they were really well paired because they had a slightly antagonistic relationship. So it wasn't, it was Dylan and McCartney would have been an interesting musical pairing that never quite happened, I think. But they didn't quite have enough of a relationship. Dylan Dylan and Ringo had a relationship, but didn't really do anything. Dylan and George were too close, but Dylan and Lennon were the obvious touch points in terms of the kind of lightning rod relationship between them, and culturally the importance of their sheer fame and their contribution. And then I wanted to look at their anti-war protest music because I felt they both had something really interesting to say about that. And you couldn't really compare their protest music in terms of domestic politics because it wouldn't really make sense. They would have different understandings of those things. But in terms of international politics, the anti-war, anti-military industrial complex stuff would make sense to compare because in many ways they were writing about similar issues. And so that was the first section. And I used a Marxist sociologist called R. Serge Denisov, who was an American sociologist who was the first person in the late 60s to write about protest music. So that's one part of the Marx part. He was really interested in how protest music works and the mechanics of it and what makes an effective protest song and what causes people to gather together around a song. It's kind of similar to religious songs, actually. They function in a similar way. Lots of inclusive, plural pronouns, lots of we and us, and lots of action, problem action type stuff, solution action type stuff, which Lennon and Dylan both wrote unusually in the 60s because protest music was moving away from that. And then I wanted to compare going from a singular issue, so anti-war protest music in the 60s. I thought it would be interesting to look at Dylan and Lennon's sense of the past and how they use historical figures in their work, because probably more than any other artist, they cite dozens and dozens of figures from the past in their lyrics. Very unusual to do that for a pop writer. So I used another American Marxist literary theorist called Frederick Jameson, and he's one of the people who really codified what Marxist literary theory was, this idea of looking at class and politics and the relationship between politics and literature and popular culture. He did a huge amount of work around that in the 80s. So I used him as the basis for that to get an understanding of what they were doing with their sense of the past. And when you think of it in terms of culture and the kind of how Marx thought about the way the world works and the big movements in the world, which is really changes in the economic system for him. You get a sense of where they were writing. They were writing right at the end of this kind of post-war capitalist boom, and at the start of what we now know as the postmodern era. And you can see that in their music. And Lennon's kind of writing really at the end of the British Empire. So the British Empire is closing down. Every year during the 60s, as the Beatles expanded around the world and their cultural influence became greater around the world, through their songs about love, dominions of the British Empire were handing in their chips and saying, okay, we're not going to be part of the British Empire anymore. So the British military control and economic control of the world was gradually retreating. And the Beatles became this kind of cultural ambassador through writing songs about love and peace. And that literally happens from 64, 65, 66, every year as they get bigger and bigger. So that's one way of thinking about it. And then with Dylan, it's more to do with his background in the Midwest and growing up in Hibbing and in this area where the entire landscape's been just stripped away literally by the iron ore mines, which then went to be used to build the skyscrapers of New York City, where he then travels to get involved in the urban folk revival scene. So the frameworks of the buildings looking down over him as he was penning these songs about the Midwest, you know, Girl from the North Country, were dug out from the material in the ground around his home, which is just completely scarred, and they call it the Grand Canyon of the North, the Iron Range in Minnesota. So he's a great example of, again, that sort of the backstory of industrialization and the consequences of that kind of how you can read that in the music, but often it's not immediately obvious, but it's certainly there. It's in Dylan's songs, and it's in his own writings about his songs. And then so it goes from one issue, anti-war protest music in the 60s, to the grander issue of history and the past, and how the 19th century and 20th century capitalism shaped popular music that came in the 60s. And then it gradually pans out to the great existential question of God and faith and the belief systems of both artists. And John Lennon had a series of quite profound spiritual moments in his life. And obviously Bob Dylan had the same, very famously. Had a religious conversion in 78, although that's, if you look at it, that's something that probably you could have predicted happening. I think it was a much more gradual thing than most people care to admit. And so it moves from the particular to the grander subject of history, to the grandest subject of why are we here, which unusually for both artists, they have a lot to say about all three of those areas, which is quite, shows you the profundity of their work. Not all bands and individual songwriters covered such depth. I think probably quite a few, only very few had so much to say about so many different things on such a grand conceptual scale. So they make for a good comparison like that. Plus it was fun to trace their individual biographies and where they entwined, and some of the unusual things I found out about them.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to go over here, and thank you for that background. I think what I'm going to do, I think I'm just going to throw a couple of things at you, and we're going to just go from there. The idea that John Lennon was always searching for something, I think, has to do with the father figure. I mean, this is pretty Freudian, I guess, but I think that he's always flirted with spirituality and Christianity as well. And it's interesting how we see one end, such as Imagine, and that song, obviously one of the biggest, some people call it like the Communist Manifesto of pop music, you know, and let's start there, because that's probably his biggest religious statement, and it was a huge hit. And I think the fact that the postmodernism that was brought to pop culture via musicians, essentially, this is a perfect example.
Yeah, so Imagine's a protest song. It's a really interesting protest song because he's gone through, he has this internal battle in the late 60s, particularly around 68. Is he going to support the violent attempts at revolution in Paris and the street protests? And in the song Revolution, he puts that overdub, count me in and count me out. As you can literally hear the debate going on in his head, can I support this kind of sense of violent overthrow of the state, the Communist Manifesto, essentially? And in one sense, I'm not a Marxist. I'm interested in that view of the world, but I'm not someone who would describe myself as a Marxist. I just think if you going to look at capitalism and some of the issues that it creates, Marx is an interesting critique of it, and he also ties in the idea of power and culture together in ways that lots of people have explored, in ways that make it kind of interesting to think about how popular culture works in the context of capitalism and the capitalist economy. And so Lennon's having that debate within himself. And there's so much goes on there in his personal history. and on the one hand, he meets up with some genuine Marxists, the Fourth International, and they encourage him to read Red Mole, the magazine that they have. He marches in London carrying a copy of Red Mole, which has support for the IRA on the front, which might not be that radical thing for the American audience, but in the United Kingdom was a pretty profound shift for someone who'd previously written All You Need Is Love.
And that was in the early 70s. He was,
was 71, 72. So on the one hand, he's being pulled in that direction. And Imagine No Possessions is literally it's an anti-capitalist statement because property rights are the fundamental part of capitalism. And in that sense, it's a genuinely anti-capitalist song. But on the other, it's almost the weakest form of protest you could have. He's just saying, imagine. He wasn't really a proper Marxist because he never got over the concept that consciousness was the mechanism for change. So in that sense, philosophically, he's a Hegelian, right? Hegel had this idea about we evolve through different thoughts and different ways of thinking, and human society grows through ideas. And that was where Lenin stood. Marx's whole thing was, it was all to do with the economy and property rights and systems of ownership and the production. Marx was a materialist. So it was less to do with idealism and how we think about things and what we believe. It was much more to do with the production of stuff. And one of the problems when you do challenge those big ideas, those cultural things that have existed for so long, is it's quite difficult not to get, the more radical you get, the easier it is to fall into these difficult kind of loops where you're arguing against yourself. So what most people don't realize is Lennon's mum, Julia, was in an IRA bomb in 1939 at the start of the war. That. Yeah, and it's an interesting one. Probably many American listeners probably don't know, particularly obviously the Irish American diaspora, for its perfectly understandable reasons, has been a source of, in some ways, support for Irish independence. And probably what they don't realize is that the IRA in 1939 saw the coming war with Nazi Germany as a fantastic opportunity to put pressure on Britain to relieve itself of the 6 counties in the north, and began a mainland bombing campaign. And Julia was in a cinema that was gas bombed and had to run for her life. And that same summer, people died in Coventry and in the similar campaign. And then here's Lennon, 30 years later, marching with a pro-IRA banner on his chest. Essentially,
you probably never knew his mother was involved in that.
Quite possibly never knew. Yeah, these kind of interesting little historical loops turn up when you start scratching away at all this stuff. And that was certainly one that struck a chord, if you pardon the pun. And then he did decide to jump in with both feet and released a full-on Marxist revolutionary protest album sometime in New York City, which was the follow-up to Imagine. Imagine was the most successful release by any solo Beatle, and is still sung today. It's sung before every Olympics. It's sung in Times Square before midnight every year, every Winter Olympics. It's the kind of if it's our international anthem, isn't it, as humans? And he follows it up with an album that was so didactic and revolutionary and political that it absolutely bombed. And so he was at the peak of his powers then, and it absolutely tripped up his career, and he retreated from politics, much as Dylan had done in the early 60s. When Dylan saw what getting involved with politics could do, it took Lennon another almost 10 years to realize that. And then he took a massive step back from it all and eventually went into retirement. It's an interesting song. It's a fulcrum song in his career, I think, in many ways.
Very much so. And I always thought that song was interesting. Was he at the height of his powers when he came to America and did some time in New York City? I wonder. I think that it was all a facade, because there was great hope at overthrowing Nixon. And if you look at the results, I mean, he was living in a bubble.
Yeah,
And I think this whole idea of him at the height of his powers, I think he lost some power when he left England. I
hey,
think
he
that
did. It's the Harry conundrum. He separated from the royal family and came to
there
America.
you go. Well, hey,
So it happens every time.
you know, there's interviews of him saying there's a freedom element of America that really appealed to him, obviously. And I don't know why he couldn't have done what he did. Sometime in New York City album could have probably been done in England.
Yeah.
But he said he wanted to be in a land of the free. Now, it seemed to me that his music he had much easier time. This is what my gut is telling me. He seemed to be more grounded in his homeland. You have Plastic Ono Band and Imagine really coming from there. Once he got out of England, he just never seemed to get his footing. He just seemed to be, when he was manipulated, he couldn't get back. And I don't know. Any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, I think he had obviously great connections in the United Kingdom, and he could get anything done whenever he wanted. And when he moved to America, he kind of got involved with this revolutionary sect. Really, he moved on from the Fourth International and the kind of people that were putting out Red Mole and that sort of extreme Marxism. I guess it's Marxist, a sort of Marxist-Leninist approach. And moved over to the kind of the yippie crowd and hung out with David Peel and a bunch of people in that world that I think quite quickly he saw through. I mean, there's accounts that he wanted to start a rock festival and got involved with a bunch of essentially dilettante hippie types. And anybody who's ever organized a festival knows you have to cross the I's and dot the T's and think about anything that could possibly go wrong. It's almost like scheduling a military campaign. It's a big logistics job. And they had him being flown into the festival in an air car. They were going to invent a flying car and have Lennon flown into the festival that way. It's just Dreamworld stuff. It's almost like what went wrong with Magic Alex. Moved into America when the Beatles started just having crazy ideas about how they could do things without really thinking them through. Moving now, he's on his own. He's on his own with Yoko. He's in New York, and I think he's under much more shifting sands in terms of having some stability and people around him that can guide him or offer him solid advice. He's essentially having to start again from scratch, which is what he wanted. And you know, I had a similar thing. I moved to LA for a couple of years after Sleeper, and it was fantastic. And it was like a fresh start, and it's a wonderful place to be. And I'd move back to America tomorrow if I could. Frankly, I loved it. It's such a great country, but at the same time, you are quite vulnerable out there, and I don't think he ever really understood it in much. I mean, everyone regards Lennon as the kind of the cynical Beatle, but compared to Bob Dylan, who understood very early on the dangers of being in the public realm in America, Lennon, I don't think really understood that, and ultimately paid for it with his life. You know, he was saying all kinds of things and trying to overthrow the Nixon government and organize rock concerts outside the Republican Party gatherings in '72, and Dylan just absolutely moved away from that. There is a moment when they were in the studio together. There's a couple of moments that not many people have talked about when they could have recorded together. One is when Dylan played the Isle of Wight festival and then visited Lennon at his house when he was putting down an early version of Cold Turkey and made his excuses and didn't really want to stick around this sort of drug song that John was doing. And then when in '72, when John was in New York, he was producing John Peel's album, and he's in the studio in Manhattan and invited Dylan down to hear some of it, and it had the Bob Dylan Liberation Movement anthem on it, which was a direct criticism of Dylan's lack of involvement in politics after '64, which he played. which caused Dylan to walk out of the studio as he played it to him.
Hmm.
And I actually spoke to David Peel before he died about all that, and he wasn't necessarily a completely reliable witness, but he did confirm all that story, and kind of an interesting character in himself. But that's who Lennon was hanging around with. He'd moved on from the people that he was connected to in the UK. He had many years to work out who he wanted to be with and who was reliable and who he could trust.
Yeah.
And he was in a completely new situation with none of that around him.
Yeah. And he, as I recall, after the election of 72 and having failed miserably in his album Tanking, and he was very quick to go away from that whole crowd, much like leaving the Maharishi, you know, and he was in his critique of Jerry Rubin and all that was humorous and accurate. And I think that unfortunately he got caught up in the radical chic politics of the time period and the location, and just got caught up in it. And, you know, it was a power struggle. You know, he's hanging around with the Black Panthers and the Weathermen, and everybody he wanted a piece. And so that was a very dangerous place for a guy like Lennon to be, who people wanted to use him to further their cause.
The Freudian element of that is really interesting. You mentioned him always being a seeker, and the loss. I think for John, quite early on, the loss of his father, who was a merchant seaman, and there's this famous story of him and his mum Julia being on the seafront, either in Morecambe or Blackpool, sort of a big resort in the northeast, and he's having to choose between them, and he walks off with his dad. He's about 5 at the time, and then he turns around and runs back to his mum. His dad's going to New Zealand, and so he'd never get to see his mum again, and he has to make that choice. And his dad didn't return to his life until after he was famous. I think the loss of his father early on, and then he was famously taken in by his aunt, who'd reported the family to social services and became his custodian. And her partner George passed away when John was a little bit older. George taught him to read using the newspaper and things like that. And it's a very sad story with him constantly looking for father figures, and that's the Freudian element. And it could be the band's manager or the producer. He kind of finds people that can help him and guide him, and then it kind of goes slightly weird. It goes to the Maharishi, and you know, he gets involved with the Hare Krishna movement briefly, and every now and then there's just different people that pop into his life, Primal Scream and the Yanov group, and they become everything to him, and then he sees through them and moves on. And I think the politics was much like that as well, whether it was the Fourth International in the UK or the hippie movement in New York. He sort of jumped into it and then saw through it and moved on. And but that was a constant pattern for him, which some people suggest. There's a great book by Henry Sullivan, The Beatles with Lacan, which I have here. It came out in mid 90s. It's very much ahead of its time. Lacan was a French Freudian analyst who goes through all the Beatles and looks at some of their backstory, including the tale that it's possible John's grandfather was a minstrel in the United States. He'd travel back and forth from Liverpool on the steamer, and actually, ironically, given Lennon's role in kind of selling black music back to America in the 60s, his grandfather had done the same thing a few decades before in the Kentucky Minstrel Show. So it's which is possibly why Julia had a banjo. That possibly came from him via Alf, which is why John only knew banjo chords when he met Paul, and Paul had to show him how to play proper chords on the guitar. So again, that's another example, a bit like the IRA thing of you scratch the surface, and the history, the backstory, the heritage appears in there. It's full of that stuff.
Now, if you contrast that with Bob Dylan, who grew up in the Midwest with both parents, and he seemed to feel born in the wrong place to the wrong parents and went out to New York, which is where Lennon had ended up, although things went a little bit better for Dylan. But then Dylan, unlike Lennon, he always was extremely guarded and very private. I mean, especially in songwriting. And Lennon, who would tell you everything he ever did, like hitting a woman. I mean, Dylan would never say that. I mean, Dylan was extremely guarded.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how, and maybe that has, there's a geographic element to that, but that's one of the things that makes them extremely different. Now, I don't know how that, and their faith, the same thing. You know, Dylan obviously had his religious period in the late 70s, early 80s. That's unmistakable. But Lennon was a little bit more open just with everything.
So Dylan is I think he's far more cynical than John, and much shrewder, and probably a much better judge of character. And I think the difference between them is that he'd been on his own since the start. John had been part of a band, so John had people to bounce off and people to catch him when he made a mistake. And then obviously after the Beatles finished, it was just him and Yoko, and he doesn't have that same kind of protection mechanism. Dylan's his ability to confound expectations, as he said in one of his famous talks. I'm not sure if it was the Nobel Prize winning speech, but he says, I confound expectations. That's basically what I do. Starts very early on with his withdrawal from protest music, and very famously that happened. He spends about a year writing classic protest songs of all kinds, and then famously disavows it and moves on to other stuff. Although you can still hear it; it's kind of coded. Some of the songs on Highway 61 clearly got references to Vietnam and what was going on there, the commander in chief, and the song Highway 61 itself. There's clearly some commentary going on there in terms of his thoughts, but you have to read it in. You have to read it in there. Putting bleachers out in the sun and watching the next World War on Highway 61 is clearly a reference to the televised war that's about to kick off in Vietnam on American TV screens every night. So, but it's just slightly coded. His more overt protest, which was just brilliant. I mean, Shakespearean in its language. I feel the Ballad of Hattie Carroll, how you could teach in. Well, I would hope it's still going to be taught a generation from now in an English literature class. It's just such an incredible piece of poetry. But at the same time, he did write a couple of absolute classic, nailed-on traditional American protest songs, one of which, a good example is a song called Playboys and Playgirls that Pete Seeger sang with him at the Newport Folk Festival, his first appearance there. And Seeger just said it's going to be the greatest song ever written. Millions will be singing this before the year is out. And this is before Dylan was even that famous. And he forswore it. He never played it. The lyrics aren't in any of his collections of lyrics. Never recorded it properly. Even then, I think he was shying away from what happens to the great protest singers. And I think he'd probably seen that in American culture. People standing up and saying things. Well, possibly Seeger himself could be an example. And then being he's acutely aware of the McCarthy era, had written about that in song as well. And I don't think he wanted to become a victim of that kind of stuff, so he just backed away from it. Whereas Lennon isn't that aware of that backstory. He's not aware of the gun culture of America. There's a whole load of stuff he's completely blind to. Lennon just dives in with both feet.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, the main thing he was blind about was the Bible Belt when he had his Jesus comments. And I didn't realize until I started getting familiar with your work that the Jesus comment was the result of a book he was reading. Can you give us a little background on that?
Yeah, interestingly, they both were influenced by massive best-selling books, which ironically, I'm looking it up because I want to get their title right. Ironically, I think probably did more than any other book to change the shape of popular music. Here we are. So one is Hugh J. Schoenfield. It's SCHONFIELD. Hugh J. Schoenfield. And he wrote a book called The Passover Plot, which was a massive bestseller in the mid-60s. And it was a kind of, it was his reinterpretation of the New Testament. And he kind of rewrote the story of the disciples. And Lennon's famous quote in the interview with the Evening Standard journalist Maureen Cleave, where he says, Jesus was all right. It was his disciples. They were thick and ordinary. They ruined it for everyone. That is literally word for word from Schoenfield's the Passover Plot. And it's a fascinating book. It's a kind of a reimagining of history that was taken very seriously at the time. It's complete nonsense. There's no validity in it whatsoever. But because of the impact of that interview later on, when it was reprinted in an American magazine a couple of months later, it completely changed the face of popular music history, because it's because of that reprint that the Beatles stopped touring, retreated back into the studio, and did the Sgt. Pepper's album. So without Lennon reading that book, Sgt. Pepper's would probably never have happened, because that's really was the cause of the whole thing, and the protest, the difficulties they had when they toured America was, I think, what tipped him over the edge. And interestingly, in the same issue of the magazine that Lennon was quoted in, on the very front cover, they quote Paul McCartney using the N-word. That did not, and they print the word, which did not in itself cause a massive stir at the time. He was commenting on the politics of the South.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was in print. I know I've got the audio clip of him saying it. That whole Maureen Cleave interview, I mean, all four Beatles really came out of the Fab Four narrative, where they're not being the cuddly little Fabs anymore. And the Lennon thing, I think, obviously that took precedence. That was the biggest thing was made out of that. And had Lennon said, well, you know what, I was just quoting this book here, that he might have just died down. They could have protested the book instead of the Beatles, but he never made mention of that book, so far as I know.
Well, she kind of hints at it in the piece she wrote for the Evening Standard. She said he's got loads of literature on biblical history. I think she probably just meant that one book. She found that one book on his bookshelf, and he's really well versed in sort of biblical archaeology and stuff. It's literally just that one book. I don't think he might have had. I suspect that was probably the one book he read. Probably read it a couple of times, memorized the thesis behind it.
Well, he was a voracious reader, and I read 2 to 3 newspapers per day, and I mean, was reading the Timothy Leary book. So 66, we have Tomorrow Never Knows, which most people assume is a psychedelic acid song, but what do you give me your feeling on that?
It's a faith song. It's so one of the great differences between the two of them is that in terms of the book title, Dylan, Lennon, Marx God. I mean, I kind of picked that because it's the greatest psychedelic rock band lineup there'll ever be. But at the same time, it encapsulates their worldviews. And I do spend quite a bit of time talking about that song, because it's a moment when Lennon steps out of the Beatle role and really writes a song about God and death from a Vedic perspective. Again, it's a westernized Vedic perspective, because it's Timothy Leary's interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But it's just an incredible song. There's still a lot of debate about how the drums were done. Ringo has said he plays it live. It's almost, in my view, it's almost certainly possibly rock's first drum loop. But it's an outstanding piece of audio, a one chord song. So it follows the tradition of Indian and other what we used to call world musics, which are less kind of chordal and more to do with different ways of shaping melody, often over one particular centered around one chord. And it follows that tradition really neatly, and the experimentation of it, him obviously singing through various mechanisms such as a wired up Leslie speaker and stuff. It's easy to see why it will be taken as a drug song, but it's not. It's him citing the text of the Tibetan Book of the Dead as quoted by Timothy Leary in his interpretation of it. And it's really about mortality and reincarnation and the soul. So it's a really profound piece of music that shows you Lennon's concern with what it means to be human, and the importance of consciousness to his worldview, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, he's a Hegelian and not a Marxist. Everything Lennon does centers around his consciousness and his soul and his awareness of his relationship to his inner being and what that means, and mad coincidences in his life and visions and sort of experiences he had when he would stare at objects as a kid and sort of visualize things. Much as Dylan did actually out in the Midwest with his connection with nature. He has very similar stories about childhood trying to connect with the sort of spirituality of nature up there. And it's the story of Lennon is not really that one of the kind of a European little red book toting Marxist revolutionary. He's much more about ideas, spirituality, consciousness. Change has to come from within, and the material world, which is what Marx was all about, the material conditions of how we live, is the core of Marxist ideology. Lennon was really about consciousness, which affords you, of course, you can afford to be if you're a multimillionaire rock star. You can put consciousness above the material conditions of daily life.
Yeah, working class hero, my ass.
Yes, absolutely. And in many ways, like many sort of champagne socialists, a complete raging hypocrite.
Mm-hmm. Right.
One could argue. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, that the other book that influences Dylan it comes about 10 years later, maybe 8 or 7 years later. It's called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. And that's another kind of World is Nigh bestseller, based on the Old and New Testament and the Book of Revelations, I believe, although don't quote me on that, I could be wrong. But it's essentially sort of biblical end times story. And Dylan read that. And if you'd read that book and were convinced by it, then you really have no choice but to join kind of a fundamentalist Christian church, because that's basically what it suggests is what's going to happen. So it was, in that sense, it was quite a logical thing for Bob to do. But it's interesting that both of them were influenced by massive popular bestsellers that were largely cod history books that weren't based in any kind of truth. So that they kind of got the better of them to a certain extent. And both books, ironically, although they're nothing to do with popular music, both books changed the course of popular music history.
Interesting how the Beatles are, people just assume it's their music that's changing history, but there's a lot of other things going on in the background that are prompting that music to change as well. And those two books would be two of them.
And also the there's so much in Lennon's work that because he was so aware of what's going on around him, I think I argue that both writers ultimately are acutely aware of their context, their historical context, and where they sit in the world, sort of the dawn of the postmodern age, although that's not happened yet for them, obviously, but they can sense they're at this sort of end of the post-war capitalist boom, and there something's happened in the 60s and there's something going on, and they're trying to articulate it. And a lot of it seems accidental, but actually, and some of it is, but some of it, coincidences kind of happen because the right things are in place. So a great example of that is John Lennon's connection with Empire. So you might think of Mr. Kite as just being a song about a poster that he found, but actually it was a famous circus. Part of the reason it was famous was because Pablo Fanque, or Fank, however you pronounce it, was the first black owner of a circus in the United Kingdom. Probably came from somewhere in the north of India, and was a huge public figure who was a great benefactor. And the concert for Mr. Kite was one of his famous moments where he was having a benefit show, but he would do this all the time. It was what he was really well known for. And the reason why they're doing horse tricks is because the British Empires over the years, when it's been in retreat, or actually after successful campaigns, hundreds and thousands of cavalrymen would come home and be unemployed. So that the British horse tricks circus act became a great cultural thing, because every 10 or 20 years you'd have all these unemployed, highly skilled cavalrymen with nothing to do, because they'd come back for campaigns around the world. So they joined the circus, and that's what is happening with Henry the Horse and that's what built Funke's fortune as a circus owner. So these connections to Lennon's history and his country's history are right throughout his songs. You know, the holes in the Albert Hall. You know, that building was built by the same architects who built the British Empire. You can see the similarities in the architecture if you look at great public buildings in Australia and all the way through. You know, that's particular style. It was a Royal Engineers team that designed loads of those huge buildings. And you know, so when Lennon's singing about the Royal Albert Hall, he's really intimately connected to that and that whole process, and his one little part in it. He was very interesting in his ability to look around and spot that kind of stuff. I noticed In My Life is in your top 10 Beatles songs.
Yes.
And that, you know, the original lyrics of that was him on a bus journey reciting all the things that he would see on the bus journey through Liverpool, which would give you this kind of Victorian Edwardian account of post-war Liverpool as Lennon saw it as a kid. Fascinating that someone so in tune with their own sense of heritage then became such an important songwriter and was able to put it into songs that went around the world with people not even realizing where they're from.
You know, now that you say that about his consciousness and knowing what's going on around him, you have to be out and doing things to do that. And maybe that's the reason why in his later years, when he retreated, he wasn't conscious of what was going on because he wasn't interacting with any of it. Maybe that's why he wasn't productive. Maybe that's why.
He was watching a lot of daytime television. Must have watched thousands of hours of commercials and writing songs about Yoko and Sean, which were great tunes in their own right. But I think possibly to a certain extent lost a little bit of touch with. I think he knew what was going on musically. The song he wrote, "Serve Yourself," when Dylan had his conversion, Lennon was supportive in other ways and slightly poked fun at him in his own way too, and recorded several home demo versions of his own parody versions of Dylan's Christian songs, particular song called "Serve Yourself." But he did that in a punk style, piano style. He did about 30 different versions of it. So he clearly knew what was going on around him, and he knew about the different styles of music that were popular. But he perhaps wasn't so tuned in terms of what was going on as he would have been at one time when I guess maybe that's the advantage that Rubin and the Yippies brought to him. It sort of put him in a place, a sort of pot boiling cultural moment where there was a lot going on, and he was massively motivated to make a change.
I always found it interesting when he was giving Dylan a hard time for his conversion, and this was very near to the time he was dabbling with Christianity, and we all have heard the stories about his going to church and being very taken by the miniseries Jesus of Nazareth by Zeffirelli, I believe, did that. And this is right around the time that he was parodying Dylan. So was he I'm trying to understand. I mean, he obviously flip-flopped all over the place at any given time. What do you
Yeah,
think about the timing of that?
he's a born seeker, and I think he's still looking for stuff. And um, that there's a it gets a bit difficult on the when I put the book out, and I talked about it on a couple of Facebook sites, and it was really interesting because few people were genuinely offended by the notion that John Lennon, his name should be in a book titled Dylan, Lennon, Marx God, because John Lennon had written the song God. God is a concept by which we measure our pain and all these things he doesn't believe in anymore. But John Lennon was very fluid in his beliefs. So he went from being a full-on revolutionary Marxist to a peacenik, back to being a Marxist, and so at one point he wrote the song God, and he wrote Imagine No Religion. But at the same time, he was someone who was a seeker and was very capable in his own way of articulating those beliefs. And they were quite complex, and they were all based on the concept that consciousness is what shapes us more than the material world. So that was going to lead him down several paths, and it might have been numerology, which was, I think, a big influence from Yoko, or Egyptology. Lots of the Vedic traditions he explored and was interested in. Japanese, the Osho diet movement in Japan, loads and loads of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's probably inevitable that at some point, particularly when you're sitting around and watching a lot of daytime television in the 1970s in the United States, you're going to come across those kind of channels, and they're interesting to watch, and they can be quite inspiring. And you can hear some good stories that are interesting and cause you to rethink your own motivations in life and your own ideas about where you're going. And he certainly would have had the time to ponder on this kind of stuff. So it seems entirely natural to me that he would have had those moments. Anthony Rotuno and I were thinking about what counterfactuals, and I came up with a notion that shortly after Bob had his religious experience and joined the fundamentalist church, John does the same, and they both become disciples for the Vineyard movement or whoever it might be. And with the support, I think Dylan still is. If I was to have to put a bet on it, I think Bob is still, to some extent or other, a believing Christian. He's a Christianized. My bet would be that he's a Christianized Jew in the sort of the realm of the. You look at his politics and the songs he's written, and his very support for Jewish cultural groups through the 80s. They're often things that Christianized Jews do, and pretty much every single album of original songs that Bob's put out since his conversion has a song that is either blatantly or can properly be read as a Christian song. It could be sung in a church without anyone batting an eyelid. And he still plays them live. He's still doing songs from 1978 in his tour now. So it's and he's also cited some of his Christian songs as being his most important compositions musically. There is some of them are his most sophisticated ones musically. They're certainly his best produced in his career at the time, because he wanted them to sound good. And so I think that kind of thing can obviously clearly motivate people, and it can lead to a new view on the world and a new way of living. And if you're someone like John or Bob who's had periods in their life when they haven't been particularly healthy, that kind of worldview can be a real fresh breath of fresh air, and it gives you a sense of. I think I imagine someone like John or Bob being in a world where there's not many people they can trust around them, and then coming across a community where the people who are acting not out of their self-interest, but genuinely out of the interest of other people. And that, to me, would make perfect sense to get involved in that kind of community.
Yeah, it's interesting. You had mentioned the fans and how many of them, they see their guys, Dylan and Lennon, being open to these different things, yet they refuse to accept their openness and want. It's not like they're trying to. They want to believe in what their guy believes in. They want their hero to believe in what they believe in.
Yeah.
And like we see, it's very the kickback that you've gotten. I've seen. This idea that, I don't believe Lennon was really, interested in that. And that they don't want to count. The song God, where they're coming from, that counts. Now, why one counts more than another, I'm not sure. But it's funny how the people project themselves onto Lennon.
Both Dylan and Lennon, I've had fans of both artists in various Facebook chat rooms vehemently coming at me saying, no, this is outrageous. You can't associate these people with God. And obviously with Dylan, there's really no argument to be made. But a lot of Dylan fans really want him to be pretty kind of revolutionary protest singer still. And they get upset if you point out that he might be a little bit more conservative if you read his memoir than you want to admit. I mean, he does say in the memoir his favorite 60s politician was Barry Goldwater.
Yeah, that's pretty damning. I mean, Lennon too had some conservative tendencies, and some people, he had flirted with Reaganomics or the Reagan politics for a while, and people are just completely beside themselves and completely Twitter-pitted. No,
people completely project.
They cannot handle it, and it doesn't really make sense that if you know Lennon at all, that he wouldn't look into these things, and then he wouldn't possibly fall into that for at least a period and take some of that with him when he left it.
It's a perfect example of cognitive dissonance. If you take somebody who's, as I, was probably to a certain extent still am, very progressive Bob Dylan fan who loves all the old school protest stuff, and say he wrote that, read them that line. My favorite 60s politician was Barry, without a doubt, Barry, whatever the line is, was Barry Goldwater. And people just furrow their brows. They go, well, he's not a reliable narrator here. He's making that up. And it's like, well, it's in his memoir. So he does clearly make some stories up, and some of the timing, possibly it's not recalled properly, but that's him citing an opinion. He's saying that that's what he thinks. So you're now saying he's lying about that. Well, who knows best, him or you,
Right. And you get it from both sides. Sometimes I'll hear. I hear from these, like the song Imagine, some people don't want to say that what they're after is this utopian dream with no possessions and suggest that, well, John Lennon isn't really promoting that. He's just suggesting that you imagine it, they won't give it to you. They won't, either extreme has a problem with it. And it's very, 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 I find it fascinating that the best discussion I had on Facebook was just someone absolutely went for me saying you can't have Lennon and God. It just doesn't make any sense. And I said, well, Bob Dylan worships Jesus for 10 years quite openly. John Lennon thought he was Jesus for about 18 months of his life. He literally called a meeting of the band at Apple headquarters and said, I'm the second coming. So the idea that somehow Lennon's not connected with God, Dylan just worshipped Jesus. Lennon actually for a while genuinely thought he might be Jesus. So it's he's intimately connected with it at a profound level, and it tells us a lot more about the fans, I think, than it does about either John or Bob. I mean, it's in terms of the Reaganomics, Dylan has an incredible song, Union Sundown, that's almost never mentioned. I wish he'd play it live. That'd be really interesting. I thought it would have been fascinating for him to play it live during the Trump era, because it's basically it's a protectionist Trump song. Okay.
And I don't want to upset the sort of Bob Dylan fan I was until I wrote the book. But if you read the lyrics of that, he's not being ironic. He's basically saying, the Union Sundown is it's a fantastic pun, actually. It's a pun on the union, as in the United States Union and the economic hardships caused by cheap imports. And it's a pun on what that does to labor unions, because it renders them powerless, because all of a sudden their economic power has been stripped away. Much like the Wire, season 2 of The Wire, essentially, in song. And so it's yet another superb Dylan pun. But it's one of those forgotten songs. It doesn't quite fit our narrative, who we want Dylan to be, in many ways that Lennon, Lennon has them too. Lennon did 2 albums of unlistenable art music. I mean, absolutely. And Revolution 9, which I feel is a superb composition. If you listen back to that, it's an entirely listenable piece of music.
It's a very,
without a tune in.
Yeah, it's a major piece of art. Really is. Yeah, like it or not, it's an incredible piece.
Ian MacDonald, Revolution in the Head, I still think possibly the best book written on the Beatles, with no disrespect to Lewison or anybody else who's written a brilliant book on the Beatles. That was a really, really early one. It was an early starter. Came out the gates early, goes through every song, and I was fascinated to get to his take on Revolution 9. And he basically says it's the world's most listened to piece of art music, and will forever be so.
Yes,
even if you only hear it once and never play it again, it's the world's most successful piece of art music.
And it was avant-garde art music at that. And exactly. And he said, within a week, millions had heard it. And then after all this time, millions more have heard it. So yeah, MacDonald goes into he I think 5 or 6 pages worth of analysis of Revolution 9. And this is another thing I was going to bring up here, since the title of your book, Dylan, Lennon, Marx God, this idea of worshipfulness. We see this mostly with the fans, and this lack of openness of the fans, and their willingness and insistence upon pigeonholing their hero into one ideology or another is a form of worshipfulness as well. And you see this with the Ian MacDonald book is a good example of this, because this was the first time where there was a really deeply analytical approach to the book, and as such there are negative things said about certain songs. God forbid you say something bad about Maxwell Silver Hammer. You get everybody coming out after you. They can't handle it. And this whole idea of people insisting that Lennon wouldn't sing this song, I got it from, I do this thing called Albums That Never Were.
Yes.
So I put together,
it's fantastic. Yes.
So I put together 2 albums after Abbey Road, and then I kind of call it a day. That's as far as they could have gone, because in my opinion, they were no longer would have been on the cutting edge. That would have been left for the others that came after them. And on the second of the 2 albums, I had My Sweet Lord on there. I had several people say, "Oh, the Lennon would never have sang on that song." I'm like, how the hell do you know? Just because he doesn't, maybe for that time period, if he didn't believe in it, does that mean he couldn't sing on it? You think he believed in other George Harrison songs? This is preposterous. This is childishness, and people that are just having little temper tantrums. And it's hilarious. I find it, like I say, childish, and they're not able to have an adult conversation about some of these topics that they believed. And Lennon came out and said certain things, as did Dylan, and they won't accept things that their heroes have even said, because it does not align with their ideologies.
Well, George bought, that's really My Sweet Lord. The Lord he's referring to, I think, is probably Krishna, and it's a version of the kind of Hare Krishna faith mantra, which also appears in the song, obviously. But it's a more broad idea of Lord, as in, pantheistic God that anybody can worship. But in George's case, he's probably referring to him as God that would be seen by whatever your religion. You have a concept of what Lord is. So it becomes a mutable concept. You can draw it how you wish. In George's mind, I'm pretty sure it's the Hare Krishna movement. And George brought back Bhaktivedanta Manor for the Hare Krishna movement in the United Kingdom, which is a fantastic place to visit if anyone's ever over there. But prior to that, when they had nowhere to go, it was John who put them up in his garden, in his spare space on his estate. So
Mm.
John was hosting that group before George was. And the idea that John would not have sung on My Sweet Lord is just a completely misunderstanding of his whole lifelong fascination with Vedic religions and the similarities. Interesting with Dylan as well. You know, Dylan, again, we read into them. It says much more about who we are, what we read into people. So most of the Dylan authorities are from Europe, many of them from the United Kingdom. So they miss out the tradition of transcendentalism in Dylan's backstory. To be fair to Bob Dylan, he doesn't mention many transcendentalists in his interviews. It's probably because he's not asked about them. He certainly would have learned about them at school. And there's a massive tradition in American education, particularly on the East Coast, of transcendentalism and the poetry and the movement around, you know, Emerson and Thoreau and all those people, which certainly Dylan would have known about. So everybody who's a Dylan critic or authority hears Dylan writing about nature and assumes it's to do with Wordsworth or the Romantics of Europe. But no, it's transcendentalism. It's Wordsworth filtered through the transcendentalists that Dylan would have read at school. And for me, it's a big miss. It's people reading stuff into it that it's there, but they're reading it into their very much in with their own agenda. And transcendentalism is a fascinating mix of Christianity and Vedic philosophy too. And it's a really important early example of that kind of integration between East and West, which also happens in the Beatles' music. You know, when George brings different kinds of tonalities and harmonies in there and different modal ideas in the songs. As we've already spoken about with Tomorrow Never Knows. So yeah, it's to try and get an honest approach to this stuff, you sort of have to suspend what your own ideas. I mean, I grew up, my childhood formative experience was the miners' strike in South Yorkshire, which is sort of, I don't know if you know, like Billy Elliot, or the Full Monty. That was my hometown.
Oh, okay.
My
Gotcha.
childhood was basically the Full Monty without the strike.
Okay.
And so someone like Dylan or Working Class Hero by John, it was incredibly meaningful to me at the time. It spoke my truth. And then to actually write an account of them that's more true to who they are and what their real influences are and what's under the surface of their music that's more in tune with who they are and where they're from. You have to suspend your own ideas about it. But then again, as a fan, that's what draws you to it, because you identify it and you project your own beliefs and experiences into the music, and that's why you fall in love with it. So I guess it's a mixture of both, isn't it? For anyone who's a fan, you're going to have to go through that process of identifying with some part of a song, emotionally investing in it, and then stripping that away so you can write about it in a neutral way that's a bit more closer to the truth of what's really going on. I think that's the difficult and interesting part as well.
Yeah, fans hang on a little too tight, though. I mean, music to me is something can mean different things at different times, and it grows for me. And I can come back to music. I can leave it be, and decades later come back. People got to have an investment with the songs. It's almost more a bigger investment with the artist. And we see this projection of, you know, some people get really angry that there is, like you say, that there's some kind of connection between Lennon and God. Why would they be angry about that? I mean, I don't understand why that there wouldn't be both, because apparently there was with Lennon. And, you know, you have many books you've got. The Atheist, the Christopher Hitchens, the God Isn't Great. And then you have his brother writing a book, The Rage Against God. And you see these projections. It's very, very interesting how this is all connected. So those are some of the things that I connected when I saw the title of your book.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not a conversation that everybody wants to have. Not everybody wants to get this deep. Hey, I just want to listen. I want to hold your hand and like a Rolling
Yeah.
Stone and leave it at that, which is perfectly fine. But the fact of the matter is, the reason why both of those guys and God and Marx are so fascinating is because of what they produced, and it's life giving, and they want to understand that part of the life.
You can draw some pretty profound analogies when an artist is working at a level that Dylan and Lennon are, and then they're involved in culture at in such depth, such that everything they do is commented on in the media and people know about it. And there are some quite profound hookups that happen. Probably my favorite in terms of the religion aspect is that there's a period in the late 70s when both Bob Dylan and John Lennon deny human evolution. Now, that was just at that. If you think about the sort of trajectory of the debate in terms of religion and culture, and particularly in the West, we in the early 2000s it was Christopher Hitchens and the kind of the new atheism movement, and I think that's largely been replaced now. That people have kind of decided where they are on that, but then a few people, I mean, someone like Jordan Peterson is an extremely controversial figure for a number of reasons, but I think one thing he's done that's interesting is he's made the case for the social utility and the necessity of religion and faith. And in my own experience, I got sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, and although I wouldn't describe myself as a person of faith or religion now, certainly for a period in my life 20 years ago, having a strong faith in God allowed me to improve myself, and without that I doubt very much if I'd even be alive now. So I really understand. I have to take issue with the whole the sort of four horsemen of new atheism. God is not great. Everything about religion is toxic. The Richard Dawkins approach.
Yeah.
I think that has to be wrong, because I know in my own personal experience, even as someone who'd probably describe themselves today as an atheist, in my own personal experience, faith made a great change in my life. So yeah, I think we have to move beyond that. And I think Bob and John Lennon were both beyond that, probably from the mid 60s, or they swung around in that. You can hear John Lennon having that debate within himself in the late 60s or from the mid 60s onwards, actually, in his music. But one of the to go back to the historical ironies that pop up, a little bit like the IRA one, is that in the late 70s, both of them, if you go back into the trajectory of the debate around religion, we've gone through new atheism and now we're in sort of post new atheism era. But in the late 70s, the whole thing was the missing link. And we just discovered the quote unquote missing link that arguably connected human life with that of the developed apes. And that was a skeleton that came to be known as Lucy, after Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, because that's the cassette that was on the little cassette machine that the scientists in the Rift Valley were listening to. They had about three cassettes, and one of them was Sgt. Pepper's, and they listened to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. It was the most played song. So they found this skeleton and called it Lucy, because it was a female. I called it Lucy. And around about that time, the reason why John and Bob were being asked about it in the press was because the debate, the religious debate, the discourse in culture at the time was about the missing link. And both men stridently denied human evolution, said it was all complete nonsense. Bob, from his theological perspective in the church that he joined, and John from the Vedic tradition, which believes in evolution but not for humans. It believes in reincarnation for humans. So as this skeleton had been discovered, named after one of John's songs, both men were on one side of a furious public debate about the missing link, completely denying the possibility of human evolution from or any kind of connection with the ape family. which is another one of those little sort of historical moments that if you scratch deep, you find in their lives together, that is not something that comes up in many other artists. That there's great songwriters and great performers, but the profundity of themes that they chose to deal with in their music allows for these kind of things to happen.
Very true. Well, I think that's a good place to end, Jon. I think this was I could go on for hours. There's a lot to talk about here. Maybe we'll have to have you back to discuss some more specifics of the book. And I think
we could go through some particular songs, maybe. I mean, I'm a huge fan of what you do. I love the fact that there's such good, high quality podcast material out there, and yours is certainly, well, I can just see it growing and growing, because it's just really, really good stuff. So I'm
I really
genuinely privileged
to
be able to be here and chat to you about it, and would definitely love to come back and talk more.
Yeah, we'll do an Ian McDonald of our own, and go through some songs and break them down in a different way, which I think would be good, because I think most people are tired of the adulation of the Beatles in particular. And if it's all adulation, you're seeing a lot of the same things. And there's some adulation in critique as well. And so that's what I've been trying to do, and offer a little bit of a different take on all this music that we love, and offer it in a little bit of a different way. And I would love to do that with you. That'd be wonderful.
Awesome.
All right, well, let's plan on that. So, Jon, I'm going to put links to your book, Dylan and Lennon, Marx God, in down below in the description. And is there any other place you'd like to send people to see any of your work?
Well, there's a couple of anything. My band in the UK is Sleeper, and we've put out a couple of things over the last 4 or 5 years. And then the project I'm currently on at the moment is one called 24 Songs with a Wedding Present, which has been a single every month this year. And they're all available on your all good record stores and online. So yeah, if anybody wants to hear any of the music I've done, that's the 2 projects I've been working on recently.
All right, I'll throw some links of that down below as well.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Jon. I really appreciate you joining. And for everybody looking for more of this type of stuff, check back here on Pop Goes the 60s.